Welcome to the Network for Responsible Public Policy. I'm Jenny Wilson, a trustee of NFRPP. At the Network for Responsible Public Policy, our mission is to bring timely, fact-based programs to educate, inform, and foster civic engagement. Tonight, we welcome the distinguished scholars, Professor Axel Honneth and Professor Nadia Urbinati, who will explore the complex and often misunderstood philosophy of socialism. Also joining our panel tonight is John Judas, an author and contributing editor at Talking Points Memo. John is the author of The Socialist Awakening, published in 2020. An updated version appeared as part 3 of The Politics of Our Time, Populism, Socialism, and Nationalism in 2022. Welcome. We are honored to have you all here tonight. And we're thrilled to welcome back our friend, New Republic staff writer, Timothy Noah, who joins us tonight as program moderator. Thank you all for being here. Please visit nfrpp.org to read their extensive biographies. Just a couple of housekeeping items. Audience questions. We will respond to as many audience questions as time allows. Please use the Q&A box to submit your questions. A video of tonight's program will be posted in the next 2 weeks. Videos of all of our past programs are available on our website or our YouTube channel. We encourage you to share our videos with your friends. If you value our programs and the wealth of information that our distinguished panels share each month, please consider a year-end contribution to NFRPP to help us meet our fundraising goals. Your generous support ensures that our programs will continue. A minor scheduling conflict has arisen, and unfortunately, Professor Urbinati will have to leave the conversation early. However, the dialogue will continue. Professor Urbinati, thank you for being here tonight. So let's get started.
Thank you very much for having me. No open question? Okay, for having me here. I'm very, very happy. I worked on liberal socialist years ago, and I think I would like to explore a little bit this strange idea of putting together liberalism and socialism. Just to give you a few hints, the idea came from inside the discussion on socialism after the Second International at the end of the 19th century to become a relevant, important track inside of the socialist family around the 30s. It was an object of contestation by the communists and contestation, of course, by the fascists, and in fact, an object of persecution by fascism. One of the most important leaders of this tradition is Carlo Rosselli, a Jew from family, emigrated, and he fought in the Civil War of Spain. He was finally killed by fascists in Paris. He wrote an important book in 1930 called Liberal Socialism. And thanks to Michael Walzer and other friends from dissent, we were able to translate this book for Princeton University Press in 1994. The main idea is the following. The socialist idea originally arose as a moral revolt against economic and social injustice. Still, its meaning soon took on the function of denouncing injustice in whatever form it presented itself, whether in economic exploitation and poverty, discrimination against those who were different or minority groups, intolerance based on prejudice, or the domination of the majority. So this socialism, according to these people, the liberal socialists, had its origin in the values expressed by liberalism. Because, like liberalism, it too was born out of a desire to resist the arbitrariness of absolute powers and any temptation to monopoly. Like liberalism in the 17th century, so socialism again in the 19th and 20th centuries against arbitrariness of absolute powers and temptation to monopoly. So those who does want, this is Rosselli's word, those who does want to get to the heart of the idea of justice will encounter freedom because they encounter the value of the person. I only want to bring the socialist movement back to its original principles, to its historical and psychological origins, and show that socialism, in the final analysis, is a philosophy of freedom. This is the important contribution of liberal socialism, which was practically convinced that the source of the human contradiction was in labor. Labor is a central issue because, on the one hand, it is a source of pain and subjection to sacrifice and also to possible dominations. On the other hand, though, labor is the condition thanks to which human beings can express their own creativity, the sense of the responsibility toward their friends, family, and society. So how to combine together these two issues, these two opposite trends which are connected to labor. And according to these authors and the movements related to these liberal socialist movements, labor can solve the problem. No, it's never a solution, but can try to put together or to find an equilibrium with these two opposite forces through rights, civil and social rights, thus involving the government in a work of looking for the conditions or the opportunities thanks to which human beings, and in this case citizens, can be able to support, at least on the minimal condition, to support their economic life in an autonomous way. So the question of dignity in labor and the citizens, and the question of freedom within human relations within the labor activities inside of the factories or the working places, or in relation to the colleagues among the domain, within the domain of labor, and dignity and freedom in relation to the larger community, thus the state and society. I think that this today in particular is extremely important. Remember that socialism can be connected to democracy, it can be connected to liberalism. It is very hard to connect socialism to fascism, although it's possible to connect it to nationalism, and it's very impossible to connect it to communism, social communism, whereas it's complicated, so liberal socialism is perhaps less complicated. This is something that interested very much the authors connected and the fighters for freedom connected to liberal socialism. And with that, I would like to give you the chance to criticize, oppose, and ask questions. Thank you.
Whoa.
Timothy, you're muted.
Am I muted?
Nope, you're good.
Okay, I couldn't hear you, Tim. Did
Okay,
you say...
here I am now. Sorry. Let me step in and ask, first of all, are liberal socialism and democratic socialism the same thing?
No, they are not exactly the same thing. Perhaps Axel will explore this distinction if he wants. Liberal socialism is more based on society in the sense of self-organizations, cooperations, activities coming from bottom up, capable of coordinations among groups of people working together and defining working together. This is a tradition that comes from John Stuart Mill, from Hobhouse, is a tradition of cooperativism. Local government is very important for them. The settlement of the ordinary life, services for children, for family. And on the other hand, instead, social democracy has more a kind of centralistic top-down approach. The idea of the nation and thus the states capable of planning, organizing, and defining what are the main objectives a society should aim at within several future years. I think liberal socialism doesn't have this strong input with the state and nations.
Can you give us an example of a regime, a liberal socialist regime in the past?
There are no regimes, and there are no liberal socialist regimes in the world, never been. It is very difficult to keep a balance between justice and freedom, as we know, between justice as distribution of fair distribution of duties and freedom. But in some moments, for instance, in the case of after World War II, partly also in England, partly in my country, Italy, partly in France, it was possible to experiment some forms of self-management and cooperation. I think the cooperative movement is the most successful example of liberal socialism.
The cooperative, tell us a little bit more about the cooperative movement.
Cooperative is of two kinds. There are cooperative productions and cooperative consumptions or distribution. They have been example of both, although the second are more less difficult than the first one, because in the capitalist economy it's very hard to compete against the capitalism from the point of view of productions of goods. But we have examples in case of some important industries which became kind of self-managed by workers in Tuscany, in my region, Emilia-Romagna, in some other regions of France. And there are cases instead much more diffused and widespread cases of cooperatives of distribution. This is very important in Europe also today, in many European countries from north to south of Europe. And it is a very important experience of how to combine together successful distribution and business with a fair treatment of laborers and good prices and containing the rise of prices.
Would the tradition in the United States of farm cooperatives, would that fit into
Yeah,
what you're talking
there
about?
were cases in the United States in the 30s and also later on. Yes, there was some cases, cases also of city or municipal forms of organizations of services, public activities. Yes, this is connected to also the states. Yes, I would say.
Okay, excellent. Well, let's move on now to our second panelist, John Judas. John, did you have an opening statement for us, or would you prefer that I just start up with questions?
Well, no, you surprised me with this. Tim called me about 4 minutes ago and asked me to do this thing. I'll talk a little. Maybe I can give something that's a little kind of different presentation. I came to socialism in the New Left in the 60s. I was in SDS. Later was a founding member of the New American Movement, which merged into the Democratic Socialists of America. And I was an editor of a journal called, believe it or not, Socialist Revolution, which later became Socialist Review. And I would say in the 60s, as I came to it, we had really a Marxist view of socialism, ownership and control of the means of production, colored also by the young Marx, alienated labor, and a view again that socialism would be a distinct stage of history that would follow capitalism and would be punctuated by a revolution, which, believe it or not, again, we thought was imminent in the late 60s and early 70s. My fellow editors used to call me the little black cloud because I thought it would take 10 or 15 years for the revolution. So that's how I was thinking, and I think a lot of people in the new left who were socialist thought in that way. Some, more crazier views, Maoism and things like that. But by the late 70s, I really didn't have a good idea what I had been talking about and thinking about. And again, this was you could see the oncoming new right. America certainly wasn't turning in that direction. I came to question Marx's theory of crises. I looked at things like Alec Nova's Marx market socialism, which existed in Yugoslavia and turned into pretty much of a flop. So 1980s again, I was thinking about progressivism, Herbert Crowley, American politics. And then I was very influenced in the 1990s by an old friend of mine, Marty Sklar, who had this idea of the mix of capitalism and socialism. And basically what Marty argued, and other people were going to later adopt the similar kind of perspective, was that socialism wasn't necessarily a distinct phase of history that would follow capitalism. But just as capitalism had developed within feudalism, socialism was developing within capitalism, characterized again by the intervention of the state on behalf of equality, pluralism, power from below, determining what the state was going to do, but not necessarily the elimination of the capitalist class. So again, that's the way I started thinking. But it was, again, a kind of theoretical thing. And I believe it or not, again, I wrote a piece for the American Enterprise Institute in a panel. I was the dissenter. And I said socialism was not dead. And there was the wake of the end of the Cold War, and they were convinced. They had the kind of the Frank Fukuyama view that it was all over and we'd reached a kind of capitalist utopia. Again, fast forward, Bernie, socialism. To my amazement, again, as somebody who had grown up with the ideas, but then just given up the idea that it could be a actual practical politics that somebody advocated, you have this guy in 2015 running for president as a democratic socialist. And Bernie's ideas of socialism, from my standpoint, were not watered down, but were a reflection of his own political maturity, which is to say that he had adopted a view of socialism within capitalism. Socialism, again, as the realization of Roosevelt's four freedoms, as something that would be more, that would bring elements of what was social democracy in Scandinavia to the United States, because we're nowhere near that. So for me, that was, again, a kind of practical revelation that maybe it was possible. And what I'd say, too, is that what you would saw developing in the 2010s as it became clear that the old, neoliberal paradigm was breaking down and that the state, again, was going to play a really important role in the economy, was a kind of shadow socialism on the behalf of a politician like Elizabeth Warren, who wouldn't call herself a socialist, but again, was very similar to Bernie. And I think within the Democratic Party, you see now those ideas. Much of American politics now is not a battle over what used to be laissez-faire versus statism, but it's a battle of how the government is going to intervene and on behalf of what. So you have Trump and the right-wing populism taking a stake in this U.S. steel company, Intel, what have you. And again, a kind of statism. The question is going to be what's going to happen on the left. And the direction I think it could take is one towards what Sanders or Mondami calls democratic socialism. So again, I think it's a live question, and your panel and symposium reflect that.
John, I'd like to ask you, with regard to Bernie, Bernie Sanders, were you watching him when he was mayor of Burlington? Because in many ways, I think that's the most interesting part of his career.
Well, I wasn't yeah, of course I watched him. Yes, that was of interest, but
What were your thoughts about that? I mean, he was sort of a sewer socialist, right?
he was a sewer socialist, but in some way Mondami is the first politician I've seen to really run as a socialist.
Hmm.
Bernie was interviewed by Colbert about, I don't know, 10 years ago or so, and they said, "Are you a socialist?" He said, "Well, I'd prefer progressive." But he's an honest guy, and he wasn't going to back down. So I don't know if push came to shove, if he was able to, he would have even called himself that. He didn't run as it. I think we see with I think what's interesting about the Mamdani election in New York is he's the first guy who really puts it forward that he runs as that. I don't think you would say that so much of Sanders, but what it showed is that we were in a post-Cold War era, that for somebody to be a socialist wouldn't necessarily knock him out of the race. I
Hmm.
mean, I used the story of when we were in the Bay Area and New American Movement, and our San Francisco chapter ran two people for the Board of Supervisors. And there was, like, I don't know, four people were going to be elected, and I think there were 16 people in the race. And our candidates came in, I think it was 14, right ahead, like 30 votes ahead of Jesus Christ Satan. The other candidate was behind Jesus Christ Satan. So it was like, even in a city like San Francisco, it was just, that was a ticket to oblivion.
Hmm.
And it was, purely something about, the campus politics. But
To the extent that there is a tradition of socialist politics in the United States, is it sewer socialism? I mean, is it? I tend to associate socialist governments in the United States with kind of reform liberalism.
Yeah.
Well, again, there was a socialist party that was pretty viable as a public force before World War One. But in my view, Debs had a kind of apocalyptic religious view of socialism. And once you had progressivism and Teddy Roosevelt and Wilson proposing reforms and the socialists opposing them, that was really spelled at the end for Debs. And it was like, and it's not surprising that Berger and the sewer socialists in Milwaukee were really the only survivors. Norman Thomas, again, was somebody people voted for, but he didn't get that many votes. He wasn't. Uh, we also had a tradition in America, from the Communist Party, which split off from the socialists and spread a lot of nonsense for years. And, they did some good things, but also identified socialism with authoritarianism and totalitarianism. And in the 60s, we had the same problem with Maoists and people who saw Cuba as a model. So I think that there is you could say, a native version of socialism that has kind of survived. And what I would hope is that it would triumph. I mean, even in the Democratic Socialists of America, there's some faction that calls themselves the New Communists or something. So that nutty tradition also exists in American politics, and it's vying with the other.
Great. Well, thank you, John. We'll move on to Axel. Axel, proceed with your opening statement.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me first say, I think I went through a similar educational process like John. So I grew up as a latecomer in the student movement. I just entered university when the student movement was on its peak, 1968, 1969 in Germany. I started almost naturally, I have to say, to describe myself when people would ask me what my political orientation would be. I described myself as a socialist at that time. I was a little bit unsure what it really is supposed to mean. I was a little bit more critical about the Marxist version of socialism because I had doubts from the beginning with regard to the idea that we can envision a final state of social development that we can describe in terms of the organization of the economy as a planned economy. I always was skeptical of that. But it took me more than 20 years or 30 years to really find out what I mean with socialism. And let me start by saying that I think I deeply agree with Nadia about the following point. I think if socialism has a specific feature, it is about how it understands its philosophy of freedom. Yeah, I think it's basically not centered around the idea of material equality, but of expanding individual freedom such that it meant to enable each citizen to have a say on how to normatively regulate society. Yeah, which means it is the idea of enabling conditions, especially in the economy, to allow everyone to make exercise of his or her individual freedom, not simply in the private sphere, not in the sense of negative liberty, but in the sense of having capacities, institutional enablements, entitlements for co-determine how to organize stuff in society. That was from the beginning then my idea, and I only was able to define it a little more clearly when I was forced to write a book on the idea of socialism, which I did roughly 5 years ago. So as John, I was trying to do my best to come to terms with what I mean with socialism. I think the socialism is rooted in the early 19th century in the impression by many leftists, early socialists, that the promises of the French Revolution, equality, freedom, solidarity, was not fulfilled by liberalism. That they were very skeptical with regard to the question whether liberalism, as it developed over the 19th century, was capable of realizing the promise of the French Revolution. They were so skeptical because they thought the way in which liberalism is defining liberty, namely mainly as private liberty, personal liberty, makes it impossible to realize something like solidarity. So I think the socialist movement in its best form, probably not in its Marxist version and definitely not in its communist version, aimed at uniting the idea of equality, freedom, and solidarity. And it thought this is only possible when we are reshaping the economy in such a way that people can experience freedom and democratic co-determination already in the economic sphere. So it was centered on the idea to enabling especially dependent workers, depending employees, to make experience in the economic sphere that would allow them to become true citizens, namely citizens that are supposed to engage in public conversation and in public discourse in order to co-determine the rule of law and to co-determine the fate of their society. So that was my core intuition when I tried to reframe what I mean with socialism. It became clear to me that socialism, therefore, is not operating with a clear vision of a future state of society. I think socialism is best advised when it understands itself as a kind of experimental enterprise. It is on search how to expand the individual freedom of all in a direction that would enable them to become co-determinators in a society. So we are very unsure today how to reorganize the economy in the future. Definitely, we are sure that this can't be done in form of a planned economy. We have learned our lessons. Yeah, a planned economy is supposed to fail and is not even better equipped to satisfy the needs of the whole population. So I think we have to understand ourselves more in terms of experimentalism, in the American sense of John Dewey, who was advocating for understanding social theory as a kind of social experiment in order to find out what ways to go in the future, what paths to go in order to expand individual freedom such that each citizen is supposed to have a say on how to regulate social matters. And that starts from the economy, because that's where people have the least freedom. Yeah, they are somewhat employers who have to follow the orders of the bosses, the management, or whatever. So they are even, let's say, de-learning what democracy means for them when they are employers. So therefore, I think socialism is still somewhat understanding itself as a political representation of the working class, as Mamdani emphasized. And he also emphasized, which I think is a good move, to understand the working class not longer in terms of the industrial labor class, but understanding the workers, the class of the workers, in terms much more of the service proletariat, as you have it all over the United States, all over Europe, people working in service, but under awful conditions of dependency, of not having sufficient wages even to make sure their own life, under conditions of having no say at all about working conditions, and so are completely deprived of all chances for co-determination. So I think, therefore, socialism is still very well advised to understand itself as, let's say, the political organ of all workers, where workers now means much more than in Marxist times. In Marxist times, it was the working class. Even Marx forgot about the thousands and millions of service people that were already working under awful conditions in the 19th century. I think now we have to learn, if we want to be the representatives of the dependent working class workers, then we have to understand ourselves much more as the representatives of this huge service proletariat that is existing, as I said, everywhere. It's even worse probably in Asian countries, but it's worse enough in the United States, and it's also very bad in Europe. So despite having there some welfare states. So I think that is what I mainly have to say, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Great. Axel, I'd like to ask you, you were talking about your more left views when you were younger. Did you grow up in West Germany or East Germany?
No, West Germany. But I grew up, I have to say, in an industrial center of West Germany in the Ruhr Valley.
What impact did the presence of East Germany nearby have on your thinking?
I think it made me very skeptical from early on with regard to what was called existing socialism. Yeah. And I mean, I grew up also as a disciple of the Frankfurt School. I grew up in the tradition of the Frankfurt School, and the Frankfurt School was always, I mean, take Herbert Marcuse, but you can also take Adorno. They were always very resistant to the idea that the so-called existing socialism would be a true representation of the core of the socialist idea. What made me, I think, a little bit more sensitive to the demands of the working class in this broad sense was that I grew up in this Ruhr Valley that was at that time dominated by coal mining and steel industry. So I grew up in a family mainly of doctors, and to their shocking expectations or shocking experiences, I called myself, even when I was 17, a socialist. They were shocked by that, but it was easy to understand because everyone around me, with the exception of certain rich families, were mainly workers. Yeah, and I grew up in a high school where more than half of the pupils belonged to the working class, so they came from the working class.
All right. Well, I'm not seeing any questions from our listeners, so I will dive in and ask you both about. It seems to me that when we are talking about a practical kind of socialism, it is a socialism that is mixed with capitalism and also a socialism that is arrived at through consensus by democratic governance. Would you both agree with that? I'll start with John.
Sure.
Axel, would you also agree with that?
Yeah, I'm not, you see, because I understand myself much more in terms of an experimentalist, I don't know where we, in what direction to go exactly in the future with regard to the economy.
Mhm.
What we have learned is what has to be avoided. What has to be avoided is obviously a laissez-faire capitalism, especially that new form of neoliberal capitalism. What also has to be avoided is kind of the idea of a planned economy. So I think we have to think more in terms of mixed economies. I think John was referring to similar ideas. So models like market socialism, certain combinations of markets and plans, even of much more corporations. So three forms of the organization of economies by cooperatives, by planning agencies, and probably by market sectors. How exactly to combine this is a question of further experimentation, I think. What is clear to me on the other side is that certain basic goods like living and home, health, shouldn't be up to the market. I think there I follow very early traditional socialist ideas. I think there are social goods that to distribute should not operate via market incentives. I think that should be in the public hand, that should be in the hand of a state, a democratic state that has to take care of these basic needs. And these basic needs are definitely not satisfied sufficiently today. So it needs in the future much more investment in public goods. Probably it needs huge housing programs. Probably it will need much more welfare rights than we have today. But again, to make sure, there is a distinction between a social democratic agenda and a socialist agenda. A social democratic agenda for me is mainly oriented towards welfare rights, security, affordability, yeah, in Mamdani's notions. Whereas I think a socialist program, in difference to a social democratic program, is much more oriented towards enabling people, not only to secure them in cases of misfortune or in cases where they are running in risk of losing a job or losing even a home. I think a socialist program has to be much more active with regard to securing in the future enabling conditions, both in politics and in economics, to make everyone fit enough, I mean, strong enough to have a say, to be able to raise his or her voice in the public to co-determine the rule of the game.
It seems to me I am not a socialist. I would call myself a New Deal Democrat, which certainly has some similarities with socialism. But it seems to me that if we are looking at opportunities for socialism, there is one sector that stands out above all others as an urgent need, and that is
Healthcare.
Yes, would you both agree with that?
Yeah. I think what's happening now in on Capitol Hill, the removal of the subsidies
Mhm.
from Obamacare was this program that's kind of a Rube Goldberg machine, and one of the problems with it always was that if you were poor, then you got Medicaid. And what happened was that you might know the numbers better than I do, at about the 50 or $60,000 income level, all of a sudden everything just really jumped high in terms of premiums. So that's where a lot of the opposition, the Tea Party opposition, came from during the 2010s to Obamacare. So these subsidies were very important to it. You take those away, and we're back to really, again, a system that's just grossly unfair to people, and particularly to people in the middle. And well, they're screwing them with Medicaid too. So we're in a situation where the Bernie demand, Medicare for all, is beginning to make sense again, whereas before that, patching it up seemed to make more sense, the incremental politics. So I would expect again that demand is going to come to the fore in Democratic politics, and that's as Axel was saying, that's a public good. That's not something that we need to be screwing around with. When I got COVID, it was after the national emergency, and my doctor said, well, you have to have Paxlovid because you're an old guy, and who know. And we went to the pharmacy, and it was $700. I don't know if any of your listeners have experienced this. I mean, I could pay for it, but how many people on Medicare could pay for it? So again, our healthcare system is really broken, and it can't just be a creature of the market or of the lunatic who's the head of the Health and Human Services now. So that's an area, but we're in a very critical time where a lot of the regulatory apparatus is being destroyed right now. The Environmental Protection Agency. I'm not so worried about the Department of Education, but these very critical agencies are being wrecked. And how are they going to be rebuilt? So that again raises a question of politics and not of simply an incremental approach to improving things as they are. And that will open the way for a more comprehensive outlook that's characterized by socialism.
Yes, Axel?
Yeah, can I represent the European voice and making also clear by that the idea of
Europeans look at our country and they think we are completely insane when it comes to healthcare.
No,
and they are not wrong.
I mean, you are very different from the European countries. And that also means that socialism always have to have a local voice. Yeah, it can't be articulated as a global voice because the situation in the different countries are so very different that it always needs to locate it in the specific social and political conditions of a country. In Europe, I think the top question is definitely not the health insurance. Yeah, it is in almost all European countries, Western European countries, relatively safe, even under the pressure of neoliberal reforms. But if you go to France or to Spain or to Italy or to Germany, Scandinavian countries, healthcare is in pretty good shape, not in the best shape, but it was self-evident that in Germany, when you had to get corona vaccines, it was for free for everyone without question. So I think the main problem in Europe today is on the one side, housing. Housing is becoming an enormous problem. I think probably the problem most difficult for people to solve at the moment. This has to do with a completely unregulated housing market. And it has also to do with the shrinking of public goods, yeah, that in consequence of the neoliberal reforms, the states, even the social democratic states in Europe, gave up to invest in public housing. So housing has become the central problem. And on the other side, what is at the forefront of all problems is also the situation on the working market, on the labor market, yeah? Because there is a majority of extremely poor jobs uh, without a lot of security, without any say about working conditions, without sufficient time to even engage in political questions. Yeah, normally people in the service sector now have very often 2 or 3 jobs even to make their living. So I think the two central problems seen from the European perspective, where you have more welfare state measures, is the housing problem and the problem of work. Yeah, that people are um, working under conditions that are very often unbearable, and that gives them not even time to think about political alternatives. It is also a cause for the rise of the right-wing populist movement in all, I think, European countries. They grow, I think, because these people, and again, I repeat, it's mainly the service proletariat, yeah, the nurses, the ones who are driving Uber cars, the ones who are working in with food supplies and all this in Amazon. You have these millions of dirty workplaces. I think they don't feel any longer represented by either the social democratic parties or in the US by the Democratic Party. So it was an easy game, I think, for the radical right-wing populists to gain these people by promises that they never were able to keep or to realize. But it wasn't a relatively easy game, I think. So that was a mistake of the social democratic tradition, or here the Democratic Party. And I think we have to correct that immediately. And we have somewhat to revitalize the socialist idea. So, and that can only come via concentrating more on the awful situation of thousands, millions of employees in the capitalist labor market.
Okay, we have a tough conservative question here, which I'm from the audience, which I am going to pitch to John. Our listener says Sanders is 30 years out of date. Even Sweden and Denmark were small and very homogeneous populations, and they found that by the 1990s they deteriorated to the point where privatization was gradually increased. The Danish prime minister has vehemently denied that Denmark is socialist. And he goes on, but why don't you just address that part of the question, John?
About the Scandinavian countries? Well,
Yes. He says the
all the
Scandinavian
countries in
Mhm.
I mean, we're going through this period of tremendous upheaval internationally because of the again the collapse of the promise of globalization, and in Europe and the United States, immigration is a huge problem. People being driven from the south to the north in both cases, and a lot of competition in low-wage labor, automation knocking out the working class, and then now with artificial intelligence, white-collar labor also is going to be under attack. So I think, again, in all these countries, they're having a fiscal crisis of sorts. I don't deny that. It's a question is what to do now about it. In terms of social welfare and equality, those countries are still way ahead of us. I mean, we still have a lot of catching up to do. Um, in terms of public power, they're ahead of us. I mean, our labor movement used to represent about a third of the working class. Now, it's 7 to 10%. It's eviscerated, which means we don't have a kind of organized public power that looks out on behalf of the working class. Instead, you have these parties vying with various promises, and their program itself is buffeted by their donor classes. So we're in a real mess. And I think again, what Sanders was looking for was some element of progress in the human condition upon which we could build. And I think you do find that in the Scandinavian countries. You find that in the New Deal in America, particularly in the 1935 and 1936 and 1937, when we had all this legislation passed that made the country more equal and gave people from below more power to determine what was happening from above. So, again, I'm not denying well, Denmark, is an exception. I used to tell a story when people would ask me what I'd like to see in the America of my friend who was an unemployed writer. His wife was ran a defense company, so they were doing quite well. Then they had 4 daughters, and she got cancer and died. Now, in the United States, what would happen would be that their home would be foreclosed. Would their kids go to college? But in fact, exactly the opposite happened. He had unemployment there was for as long as what, 4 years? I think even longer than that. And the kids went to college. College was free. We don't have anything like that. We have a lot of people in a very precarious situation in the country. So again, we have something. I think we could still say that the parts of Europe are way ahead of us, and we could use them as examples, as Sanders does, of things that we should be doing here.
I wrote a book about income inequality about a dozen years ago, and I would go around and talk about the book. And I found that the one part of the book that audiences resisted, both liberal and conservative audiences, was my argument that the growth of income inequality had a lot to do with the decline of labor. And people just didn't believe it was possible or desirable to bring back labor. And I found myself saying to these audiences, if you're interested in income inequality and you don't want to revive labor, then take up chess because you're wasting your time. And now I think the audiences would be different. I think I'd be hearing different things today, certainly among liberal audiences, maybe even among conservative.
Well, you have two things going on now. You have that again resemble the 1890s or 1880s. You have on the one hand the decline of the labor movement, and on the other hand you have this winner-take-all economy in Silicon Valley and in Wall Street that's creating these zillionaires who have just inordinate power over the economy. Again, the era of the robber barons and the Rockefellers and the Carnegies or whatever. It's very similar. So I think again that's
and a similar
the
kind
Elon
of
Musk
corruption too in our
right.
politics.
The Elon Musk phenomenon is also making your ideas about inequality more relevant now than they were like 20, 30 years ago.
Axel, do you have thoughts about the kind of current moment and the prospects for a socialist revival? I mean, I think we see it underway.
Sure, yeah, that's relatively optimistic. I think looking from a more general perspective, the situation of socialism is not all too good, and that is mainly so because, as I said before, socialism has lost its capacity to represent the working classes. And so what has to be done in the future is mainly to readdress problems which have to do mainly with, I think, economic inequality, the situation of public goods, and the situation in the labor sphere to become, again, a more forceful movement than it is today. I mean, despite the victory of Mamdani here, the situation I have to say, in almost all capitalist countries is relatively bad. I would say in Scandinavia, there is still a very basic and robust welfare state, without question. If you go to Denmark, the healthcare system is fantastic. The struggles in the Scandinavian countries is mainly about immigration. Yeah, so there are certain neoliberal reforms, sure, certain sectors became more privatized, but there is still a huge care for public goods, I think, in all Scandinavian countries. They are richer than many other southern European countries, so they can afford to have a very basic, elementary, very good welfare system. But the questions are on immigration, and that's another problem that has to be solved, that has to be solved in Western Europe too, and in Eastern Europe. It's unsolved how to deal with that. And I think the socialist movement also have to find a way to address that problem without ignoring the right to to immigrate. I mean, there is a right for asylum which has to be respected, deeply respected, and the socialist movement has to incorporate it in its own program. Then there's also the ecologic disaster, also something one has to take care of. So, I mean, if I mention all these problems and all these crises, it becomes even more difficult to think of a socialist movement that can incorporate all these different concerns, questions, miseries, and to formulate it in a program that remains understandable. And that is a problem for many leftist parties now in the world, yeah, that there are so many problems at the same time, starting from immigration over ecology and the huge inequality, then the oligarchic structure of our economy, yeah, that it's more and more monopolistic, despite all promises of the neoliberal capitalism. The economy has become much more monopolistic instead of allowing free competition. It is the opposite what happened, yeah.
And then we have the basic problem too with this sort of in this country that the Democratic Party, and John has written about this quite a lot, sort of losing the working class.
Yeah.
Which is 100 years ago, if you had sort of told leftists 100 years ago that the professional class was having a hell of a time persuading the working class to accept parts of the socialist agenda, they would have been amazed, right? I mean, and yet at the same time, the Center for Working Class Politics did a very interesting study in 2024 where they found that of looking at all of the possible pitches that could be made to working class voters, the one that scored absolutely the best in polls of working class voters was the Bernie pitch. Their advice to Democratic candidates in 2024 was sound as much like Bernie as you can. John, do you have thoughts about that?
Well, what part of the Bernie pitch? The billionaire class or the programs or free college?
I think the whole thing, economic leftism. Basically, the message was economic leftism was enormously appealing to the working class. Cultural leftism was not appealing at all.
Yeah, some of it is, but I mean, again, I'll just talk against myself for a moment. One of the characteristics of the United States, as opposed to Europe, again, is this default anti-statism that goes back to the American Revolution, where the first impulse of people when the country starts to go downhill is to blame the government.
Mhm.
And again, that's been a big source of appeal. When Bernie was a big supporter of Medicare for all, they had a state program in Colorado and they put it on the ballot and it lost 80 to 20% because people were worried about high taxes and the premiums. So again, I guess I'm talking to the contrary of what I was saying, but we have big problems in the United States about putting forward democratic socialism in places other than New York City, Chicago, Oberlin and places like that. It's still a big problem. Not so much because of the communist associations, except among Venezuelans and Cubans and people like that who associated with South America, but among, again, people who fear statism, big government. But again, if you look at what Trump's doing, and if you look at the drift of what's necessary, here, I think this is true of Axel too. We were both influenced a lot by Polanyi. Is that fair? I mean, by this idea
Yeah,
that
right.
been a double movement in the history of capitalism between laissez-faire, the attempt to deregulate, to remove any kind of protection on workers, and on the other hand, the intervention by the state and the working class to try to regulate, correct capitalism, and again associate that with the New Deal. We're in a period similar, again, you could say, to both also the 1920s, where you have the breakdown of the international economic system, and things go either to the left or the right, but in either case take a statist direction. I'm getting
You know
away
what?
from the question about Bernie, but that's again, I
Right,
think
right.
he represents the left wing uh, answer to the problem that we're having. But again, in the United States, it's going to be hard to put across because of all these little complications we have in our past and in our ideology. I mean, we don't look at the French Revolution; we look at the American Revolution.
Can
Mm.
I can I
Yes, Axel.
can I say something? It always astonishes me a little bit with regard to the United States, how short memory seems to be here, because it is obvious that one of the most healthiest periods you had in the US history in the 20th century was the New Deal. And
Mhm.
the New Deal was a period of a strong government coming up with a lot of social policy programs, yeah, enabling the working class, increasing employment, coming up with many, many plans for making the life of the working class much better. And so it was the opposite of an anti-statist period. Yeah, it was a period where people enjoyed, obviously, everything: high taxes, enormously high taxes, social policy programs from the government, from a very strong government. And this all seems so suddenly forgotten that you remember mainly those elements of your own constitution which are emphasizing the very negative liberties of all the citizens. Yeah, the First Amendment included. This is so anti-statist and anti-government that it is surprising, taking a country that had developed a New Deal program, which is still kind of exemplary for at least a social democratic policy.
And the New Deal also did a great job protecting capitalism from itself. We didn't
Yeah,
start having bank failures, large bank failures in this country until we deregulated banks.
exactly,
And that was
exactly.
after a couple of generations had passed since the 29 crash. People didn't remember the dangers of unregulated banks. I think there's a good chance we're headed for another one now with the shadow banking sector. Last question for each of you. If you are Mamdani, what would be your top quote unquote socialist priority, knowing that you are operating you don't have a lot of running room as mayor of New York City?
Oh, you should give that to Axel. He's in New York, right?
John is
All
great.
right, Axel, you want to start?
I think he has the right intuitions. Yeah, he wants to represent the vast majority of New York citizens, not consisting of Wall Street people, but consisting of poor workers in the service sector, and he's naming them. Yeah, he's even addressing them in his wonderful speech. He was referring to them by name. I think his main concern has to be housing. Yeah, I think that should be top priority. This is the policy he can engage in the limits of the power he has. He has not very much power, but the power he has, I think, allows him to reinvest money. I don't know what power he has with regard to taxes. I'm not familiar enough. He has a certain power to increase taxes, but probably not individual taxes, but taxes for businesses. I think he has to do that immediately, despite the problems that might be risked by that. And he has to take the money from the riches to invest in housing programs, huge housing programs, I think. This is what I can say from the perspective of somebody who is neither a citizen of New York nor even having a chance to have a vote here. Yeah. So
I'm a citizen of Silver Spring, Maryland. So the one thing I will say is he does not have much flexibility as far as fiscal policy goes.
Right.
In 1975, New York had a tremendous crisis. It was always summed up in the headline of the New York Post: Ford to New York, drop dead, because the federal government wouldn't come in and help. And what ended up happening was the state took over the fiscal policy of the city, and taxes and budgets have to go through the state. They have to go through the governor and the state legislature. So he doesn't have a lot of flexibility. I mean, he can propose, but they have a veto. I don't know, again, exactly how the mechanics work. He has an advantage in the sense he was a state legislator and he knows people there. And it looks like he's doing things in the right way so far in terms of his appointments. He's not appointing people out, who come out of Mao's China or whatever. He's appointing people who know how to do it. And, he has to run an efficient government. He has to look out not only for housing, but for crime. He's got to make his peace with the police department. And beyond that, he's going to have a lot of trouble, and especially if the economy starts to turn down, and if Wall Street starts to have a problem, because it still is the main financial support for the city. And if that starts to go south, he's going to have a lot of problems.
He'll have a lot of governing problems. His political problems might ease up a bit, though, under those circumstances.
Oh, I don't know. Yes, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I can't. I'm not the one to ask about that.
Right, right. Well, I want to thank you both for participating in this very interesting conversation. I learned a lot here, and so I'm going to close our conversation by saying socialism is complicated, and we've learned a lot about it tonight. And thank you for joining us.
Yeah.
Professor Honneth, Professor Urbinati in absentia, John Judas and Timothy Noah, thank you for joining us tonight and for sharing your extensive knowledge and wisdom with the NFRPP audience. This is a bigger conversation, and we hope you'll come back to continue the discussion. Your insights into socialism will help our audience shape their perspectives with clarity and based on facts. So thank you very much. Please join us on Thursday, January 15th for an important panel discussion on anti-Semitism. Thank you all for being here. Good night.
thank you.